Okay, so we left off on the logos. We were talking about uh, the voice, the logos, maybe something that the plants allow you to hear, or there's tons of stories about the logos. And one book that I read that I think is a must-read for everybody that's interested in the logos is this book by Julian Jaynes, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. I try to read 100 books a year, and I gotta tell you that this is probably top 5 I've read in the last 5 years. It's Julian Jaynes was a psychology professor at Princeton in the 70s, and right around the time Chomsky was coming out with his ideas of how language is formed. This is kind of an alternative theory, and it'll blow your mind. I mean, if you haven't read Julian Jaynes, you gotta get it. You gotta pick it up. It'll open your eyes to a lot of things. A funny story. I found myself on campus at over at UH, and I ran into one of the big dogs in the language department, and I had walked into his office, and he had an amazing library, and so we were talking about books and language, and he had asked me if I had read Chomsky. I said, yeah, I have, and to which I replied, oh, have you read Tom Wolfe's new book about trying to take down his theory? And he said he did, and thought it was kind of snarky, which I agreed, and we had a little bit of a laugh. And then I had asked him if he had read this book, Julian Jaynes, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And he kind of stared at me for a minute. No, George, I've never heard of that book. And I told him, well, I kind of think that this guy might have it right. Chomsky's, come on, one of the greatest minds around. However, when it comes to language, I think this guy Julian Jaynes might have some points to score on him. And so I began telling him a little bit about what the book was about, and he was very interested. And I said, I'll bring you a copy. I have an extra copy. He says, no, I'll read it online. I'll find it. And that was on a Friday. And I met him on Monday, and he says, George, you got me in a lot of trouble. My wife and I had stuff to do over the weekend, but I got that darn book, he said. I couldn't put it down. Blew my mind. You were right. It's fascinating. And for me, it's always rewarding when I recommend a book to somebody and they read it and they're blown away. And they're really blown away. Like, they really read it and they're blown away. It's just nice to share that same kind of insight with them. And so he's like, I couldn't put it down. My wife's yelling at me, hey, we got this stuff to do, but I couldn't put the book down, George. And so after we laughed a little bit, I said, so what do you think? I mean, you think that guy scores some points? You think there might be some holes in Chomsky's theories? And he goes, well, he changed his tone. He went from being laughing to, well, this book that I read, this Julian Jaynes, is very controversial. And I said, yeah, like Galileo or Copernicus. We started laughing, but I hope you guys get an opportunity to check it out. Let me tell you a little bit about it. First off, it's masterfully written. The guy was he's a genius. But he talks a lot about the logos, bringing it back full circle. And he talks about, the Homeric verses. They talk a lot about how Athena, or they talk about the gods, like Mars. They heard, I got angry and it was time to go to war. I heard Mars call to me, or I was overcome with rage, and whenever they talk about these emotions or the gods coming to them, they're talking about the gods speaking to them, the animos, I guess, or it's throughout all the old Homeric verses and Greek tragedies, and a lot of people today believe that is just a metaphor for emotions like anger or love, or Aphrodite would be love, and anger would be Mars, and, you know, when you read the Homeric verses today, people say, oh, well, this is clearly just a metaphor for him being filled with lust or being filled with anger, or, you know, pick your poison. But Julian Jaynes makes a different claim. He says that people actually heard those voices in their head. And when you heard Mars, it was a voice in your head that told you it was time to fight, which is similar to what we now call the fight or flight, you know, reaction. He goes on to talk about, they've done experiments on people, you know, in the last, you know, since the 70s, on where they've stimulated the opposite side of the brain. You know, you have Broca's area and Wernicke's area, which are the speech centers of the brain. And they've hooked up electrodes to corresponding parts of the brain on the opposite side and stimulated them, and people were actually able to hear voices. You know, if you think a little bit about how the brain works, you know, it's got obviously the frontal lobe and the different cortexes, but there's corresponding, according to some literature, there's corresponding points on opposite sides of the brain. And Julian Jaynes believes that as we've evolved, that there used to be an area for speech on the opposite side of the brain, on the opposite lobe where Wernicke's area and Broca's area are. And it was those parts of the brain that would light up, that would allow you to hear the logos. And, you know, maybe it could be that we've evolved to not use that part of our brain, or for some reason, you know, that part of our brain is not being stimulated. You know, I often wonder if maybe some of the you know, psilocybin or some of these neurotransmitters in the plants activate that particular part of the brain, and that's what allows us to have these audio hallucinations. And if it is what allows us to do that, might some of these audio hallucinations be, you know, telling us to do things that were told to some of the heroes in the tragedies? You know, I don't think that would be a bad thing. There's quite a bit of heroic deeds and wisdom and intelligence that maybe we could be tapping into. But it's fascinating. He goes on to talk about work he's done with schizophrenics, and he ties that to, you know, some of the questions he's asked these schizophrenics is, you know, do you hear voices? And the answer is yes, I hear voices. And then the next question is, what is it about the voices that you hear in your head that make you do some of the things you do? I'm sure most of you watching this understand that sometimes schizophrenics are in real danger of hurting themselves or other people because they hear voices. But not only do they hear voices, but they do what those voices tell them to do. And so one of the questions Julian Jaynes asks is, why do you do that? Can't you just shut that voice off in your head? Can't you just tell that voice to, hey, knock it off, or I'm not going to do what you say? And he gives a description of a schizophrenic man that says, you know, people don't understand. Like, you know, when you hear that voice, it's like someone being this close to you, you know, and saying, listen, I want you to go do this thing, and it never stops. You could run away, but it's still right there in your head. And it makes me think of, you know, in today's world, if someone gets this close to you, you're probably either fighting or you're telling a secret. But if you heard a voice in your head, imagine someone being that close to you the whole time and not being able to get away from them until you did what that voice told you to do. And when they've put these people into the fMRIs, they could see that same spot that Julian Jaynes theorized was activating, where the logos might, the corresponding area in Broca's area and Wernicke's area. They could see that in the fMRI, that particular part of the brain was lighting up. And it's such a fascinating idea. And like I said, I'm not a doctor, or, you know, I enjoy reading and I enjoy listening to these stories and telling them to you guys, and I hope you find them interesting. But it all fits together, you know, whether it's Terence McKenna or Julian Jaynes or Jeremy Narby. And I'll be going over quite a few more books to try and weave you through this wandering road of, you know, psychedelic behavior and what can be happening. It just fits in with our motif of language and how it can be different, and, you know, the linguistic pathways that we can take to make a better world. But for now, that is this book right here, Julian Jaynes, The Origin of Consciousness. It's fascinating. It also goes on to talk a little bit more about, you know, the cutting of the corpus callosum and some of the experiments they've done with people that have epileptic seizures and what happens when you cut the corpus callosum. And it's a fascinating read. I hope everybody here takes the time to read this book, because it'll blow your mind. So that's what we got so far, and we've kind of covered a little bit of Terence McKenna, Jeremy Narby, and Julian Jaynes, and we're going to continue our adventure down the world of psychedelics and language and some other cool stories. We're going to try to fit some Zen in here in a little while, and looking forward to getting my first comment and hearing what you guys have to say. Super stoked to be doing this, and, you know, even if nobody watches this, I love reading books, and I love telling stories about books, and I hope to reach people that like to read books. So, hope you guys are having a great day. Aloha.